Good morning, everyone. Welcome at the third webinar on quality in higher education within the EDTU webinar week. Last Tuesday, we had a webinar on quality related to MOOCs, and yesterday about the peer learning activity on quality for online and blended education, and a contribution by the ENQA working group on e-learning. Today, we have a contribution from John Roswell and Karen Keir from the Open University UK Milton Keynes. And they're going to reflect on lessons learned from 10 years of E-xcellence quality reviews for e-learning, of which I've been part of since the beginning, and both are the main contributors to the E-xcellence benchmarking instrument. And I'm happy and pleased to see that we can reflect on 10 years use of the instrument, which is really widely used now in Europe. So very curious about the results of their study. I would like to give the floor to John and Karen.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Karen Keir, and
I'm John Roswell. Good morning.
So we're going to take you through some work that we've been doing on the excellence framework for assessing or enhancing the quality of e-learning in European institutions. We looked back over 10 years of these series of projects, and what kind of results were people finding about what challenges they were facing. So we'll come to that later on, but we're going to start off with a bit of a poll for you. So I think George is going to put up a poll just to see what you think the main challenges in this area are. Yeah, okay. Okay, so these are the 6 areas, broad areas, that form the excellence framework for e-learning quality. So we just want you to choose one of those which you think is the most important. If you can't decide which one, then feel free to choose 2, and then we'll see what people say, and that'll link to some of the findings of the research that we carried out later. So just click on one of those boxes and see what you think is the most important area. We've put a little bit of explanation of what the 6 categories mean there to help you to do that. Okay, and we're putting our own votes in there as well. So I don't know how long it takes for the results to be shown. Maybe George can see whether there are results coming through now. Aha, here we go. We're gradually building that one up. So there's, John, you were going to talk through this, I think, weren't you?
So it looks like the top there is curriculum design, how e-learning is used across a whole program study. That seems to be picked out as the highest, followed by strategic management, getting a high-level view of e-learning within an institution, its role and how that plays. Down there is low are course delivery, the technical and practical aspects of e-learning delivery, and not appearing at all is student support. So support, information and guidance provided to students. So it'll be interesting to bear that in mind when we come to look at what we found in reviews over the last few years. So curriculum design was top, I'll just make a note, and student support and course delivery were quite low. Okay, let's go on to the next one then.
So this one's a little bit more detailed, so we're delving down into some of these categories, and there's a few examples of specific points from those 6 areas. So you can see that the top one, for example, is another more detailed one around strategy, and then there's quite specifics to do with, for example, open educational resources and helping people to carry out innovation in this area. So again, could you have a little look at these and see which one or ones you think are the most important. Feel free to select any or all of them if that's what you think. So we'll give a few minutes to that and see what people come up with. Meanwhile, John and I will see what we think as well. I think workload, because I've been helping to manage the department and it's quite a problem.
I still think that it's the right machine.
Ah, okay.
Right.
In spite of VLEs, we still haven't got the tools.
Nope.
So we'll wait a few moments to give people a chance to have a look at that and to think about what they want to select, and then George will show us what the results are. Here we come. Okay, so John?
Right, so agreeing an e-learning strategy has come out top on that one, which reflects a little bit, I think, that strategic management was quite high on the previous slide. And then staff workload management and encouraging educational innovation, which I think are both aspects of staff development, are also quite high as well.
Interactivities.
Technical infrastructure is quite low, and using OER is very low as well. So that's very low. And technical infrastructure is low. And again, administrative support for students also very low. Doesn't appear. Right. Well, that's interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We'll reflect back on what that looks like when we look at our own results and reviews.
Your e-learning tools has come out at 18 or 19%. I can't read that. So that's relatively high as well.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Right, we'll go back to the presentation, I guess, now and move on. So we'll be returning to reflect on those results in relation to our own research results a bit later on. So we've made a few notes of what those percentages of what you thought actually were. So I think, John, you're going to field these initial slides about quality.
Yes, I'm just going to start with a few slides addressing the kind of general landscape of quality, because it is a bit of a muddly one, I think, in HE. First of all, there are a number of different reasons or purposes for doing quality assurance in HE. One of them is to do with reputation of an institution, because that's very important to recruit good students and then produce good graduates. That becomes a sort of cycle thing. There's another aspect which is about, from the point of view of society and government, about compliance and consumer protection. So making sure that it's an aspect of accreditation to make sure that we're only offering quality courses to students. And there's some guarantee of uniform standards across the sector, so that a degree from one institution is as good as that obtained somewhere else. And there's another aspect which is about process improvements, about enhancement, about improving what an institution does. So often that has a more internal focus, but it also needs to be contextualized, because you need to understand your own particular students and what they come with and what they might leave with. So there's aspects of looking at added value, what you actually add to students who arrive at the institution. So those are the overall sort of purposes. There are also a number of different approaches that can be taken to quality assurance in e-learning. And these range from looking at compliance, or whether the focus is actually on enhancement, so about whether you can do things better. There's an argument about whether norms are appropriate or not. Can you specify certain things that have to be done, and is that sufficient or not? Should you focus on the process or on the product, about what you actually produced as a course? Is it important to look at the pedagogical models that are involved? Should you focus on what goes into a course, Or should you look at what comes out, in other words, the students and how they perform and so on? Is self-assessment the right approach, or must you take external review? All those are different tensions and approaches, and one answer is to say, well, actually, they're all important. So you need to take some sort of holistic approach, and particularly to look at the process and the context in which a course is produced, as well as the final product. And we'll see an aspect of that with E-xcellence. There's also a change in the landscape in that, well, particularly E-xcellence was originated in a time when there was a distinct split between e-learning and campus-based education. But that's really no longer the case, and the future will be blended in various ways. And actually, there are a number of different dimensions in which that blend can take place. Whether it's on campus or at a distance, whether students are studying full-time or part-time, whether they're studying face-to-face or online, synchronous and asynchronous, either digital, physical, virtual. You can come up with a number of different dimensions. And so the challenge really, I think, for any institution is to find a mix that's appropriate for the needs of that particular institution and the students involved. So that isn't to say that there's going to be a single answer. There's going to be many different answers according to different contexts and different sets of students. So going back to quality, finding an instrument, something that works to help you understand quality, has to be very flexible, because it has to cope with this range of different mixtures or blends of what people do. And to point out that, of course, the reason that this change towards blended provision is happening is really underpinned by this ubiquitous access that we have to the internet these days. And so there are a number of enabling things that have happened over the last few years which make this move to blended provision such a powerful one, and starting with this underlying digitalization of both society in general, but also of education in particular, rise of social media and so on, the fact that online library provision is now quite widely available. So there's a lot of change that's happened both within universities and in society generally that have supported this move to blended provision. So there's still a tension or some challenges for quality assurance of e-learning and blended learning. And so to pick out a few of those, there is a tension between looking for high-level standards that are independent of the mode of delivery, so ones that will work irrespective of whether it's e-learning or face-to-face learning, or some mixture of the blend in between, and whether to look for detailed indicators or not, compared to that high-level independent standards. There's a tension between external and internal processes. There's tension between the idea of compliance and checking and actually whether the focus should be on enhancement. And there's a tension between whether you should look at the result, the content, or you should look at process and context. So, over to E-xcellence.
Yep. So that's a lot to take into account. So to tackle all of that, some time ago, various European projects hosted through EADTU were put into place. There was a sequence of 3 projects which supported the development of the E-xcellence initiative and a label that can be gained through going through the process in a sort of formal way. It's structured, as we saw earlier on, the very first poll we put up was these categories, basically, which provide the framework for the assessment of the quality of e-learning, which is done through excellence. So you can see that we're looking at the strategy that the institution is operating with, how the curriculum is designed as a whole, how things fit together to provide degrees for students and other kinds of educational products for students, how individual courses can be designed and the sorts of e-learning elements that are in those, how the whole infrastructure is supported through the delivery, so the VLE or any other online tools that you have, and also the hardware, you know, making sure that everything is secure and so forth. And then we have support for the staff, so that includes staff development there, and then support for the students, which is a component of providing information to students and various different kinds of generic facilities that students need, for example, access to a good library, which they can use over the internet rather than having to physically come there. So you can find out lots more detail about the E-xcellence framework and processes by following the link that's on this page here. I'll explain it a little bit more. So those, as we said, are the structure of the framework, and I think I've gone through those already. So I think we can move beyond that slide now. Excellence is organised into benchmarks, and the idea of a benchmark is that it's a statement of good practice which a university or an institution can measure itself against. So there are, I think, 31 or 32 benchmarks divided into the 6 categories in the way shown on this slide. And they help institutions to be quite specific in how they review their offering and assessors to assess it from outside. So here are some examples of benchmarks. There's no need to read all of this, but just to give a little bit more detail and specifics. So if we look at, for example, number 9, which is in the category of curriculum design, this one is about what we're calling academic communities. So this means online communities for students primarily. So, oh, is it? Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll move on to the next slide to explain that then. Yep, here we go. You can read that a bit more easily now. So we're using the term social media to encompass all kinds of online communication tools. So traditionally that would have been an online forum, but there are other kinds of tools that can be used to support students communicating with each other and building communities online. So that benchmark there is an example that the universities can use to assess how well they are doing this enterprise and how well it is supporting community building for students and also supporting learning for students. So for example, you could have online forums where students are discussing various topics in the course, or you could use these communication tools to enable group work to be carried out at a distance rather than needing the students to be face-to-face. And then if you delve down a little bit more into the excellence resources, we have things called indicators, which are just to give a little bit more specifics and hints to universities as to how to put in place good practice in this particular area. So this is a set of indicators for that particular benchmark. So again, looking at how online communities can be guided and supported for students. The indicators operate at 2 levels. So the top set are examples of normal good practice. And then where it says at excellence level, these indicators are indicative of a university that is doing very well in that particular area. So for example, bringing in online communication with professionals in the area or professional bodies in the particular topic that the course is about. And for example, using group work, peer assessment, that kind of thing, all of which can be done online, but that's considered to be fairly advanced practice. So as we said, a benchmark was a statement of best practice and used to enhance quality. Was this you going to take over here? Yeah, I'll let John do the rest of this slide.
As Karen just started up saying, the benchmark is a statement of best practice. It's something that you can reflect on to see whether your own institution is performing at that level or perhaps under or above. And should make the point that the benchmarks are supported by a manual, which includes those indicators we just had a look at, and some descriptive text as well that describes what the issues are and things to think about. So the intention of the benchmarking activity is that it is a quality enhancement tool, so it allows you to identify weaknesses and strengths by collecting evidence. The indicators that are there are suggestions for the sort of evidence that you might look for, but of course, in a particular institution, you might do something a bit differently. So there's no reason to think that the indicators are prescriptive. They don't say things that you really have to do. There are suggestions for what you might do. And the outcome of this sort of process should be a roadmap of actions for improvement. So the intention is to think about what you will do that will be different, how you can improve. Just reflecting back on the benchmarks, they are quite generic. We've tried to phrase them in such a way that they're resilient as things change around us. So the one about social media, for example, didn't say you had to use Facebook or Twitter. It just says think about social media. They have been changing as we've gone through different editions of the instrument, and that's to reflect current experience and practice. So they have changed over time, and we've taken account of trends as best we can. I mentioned Open Up Ed MOOC benchmarks. There was a presentation a couple of days ago in the same webinar series. They are complementary, very closely aligned with each other. So just to move on, just to think that E-xcellence can be used in a number of different ways. So one thing is to use it as an informal self-assessment, and there is a quick scan tool, a way of running through those benchmarks quite quickly. And all the material is freely available on the website for that. You can use it as a full internal self-assessment with collecting a number of different stakeholders together to collect evidence and prepare that roadmap. That could be more or less integrated with existing institutional processes, so it's possible to take benchmarks and embed them into an internal process. The full label requires a more formal process which starts with a self-assessment and includes an external review and generates a roadmap at the end of it, and that will then be recognised by EADTU with a label badge at the end of it. And usually that process includes what's called a local seminar or workshop, so a face-to-face event with the external assessors coming in and doing a public sort of seminar or workshop which involves many people at that institution. We'll mention that later. There is also the possibility that E-xcellence could be integrated into quality agencies' formal processes, and so there is the potential that E-xcellence benchmarks could be taken exactly as is and embedded into a formal external process that's part of accreditation or whatever. I'm not sure that's ever really happened, but it's a potential. And I suspect that actually E-xcellence has been helpful in guiding QA agencies to their process practices. On to the subject of the presentation was to look at some results that have come out of previous reviews. So we looked back at a total of 19 reviews that had taken place over a period. And we were interested to see which of those benchmarks were seen as being the ones that were problematic or where there were lots of actions. So we just totted up the number of benchmarks that were noted as being problematic in self-assessments, and also the number of benchmarks where institutions said we're going to do something about that. So in other words, there are actions planned against those particular benchmarks. And we've, at one level of analysis, we've grouped them into the major areas, which are the chapters of the manuals. So this reflects really the poll that we asked you at the beginning. So let's have a look at the things that were noted as being problematic. And essentially, I think you can see there are three things that have come up relatively highly. Strategic management, particularly, we'll come on to the detail in a minute, but strategic management, that sort of overall arching position of e-learning within the institution has been seen as a problematic area in the past. Curriculum design, the very broad design of the curriculum and how e-learning will fit into that is another one. And staff support generally has been a focus of where there seem to be problems. Student support is probably maybe a surprising one that is related quite low. In other words, the provision of support services to students has not been seen as a problem. Just reflecting back on that little poll that we did, I know there were only a few replies, but I think that was some things were similar.
Yeah,
so curriculum design was certainly up there, and strategic management was up there. Student support was relatively low, but actually course delivery, I think, was, people said didn't pick that one out, and that's a little bit higher in what we've seen. And I don't think staff support was singled out particularly, but it did seem to be, historically, was certainly a major area. So these were the benchmarks, counting up the benchmarks that reviews saw as problematic. Just a slightly different take on that is on the next slide, which is where institutions said that they had targeted actions. And generally the picture is very similar, so strategic management, staff support, curriculum design are all quite high, course design, course delivery, middling. There is a change. I was going to flip back and then forward again. So this was benchmarks that are seen as problematic that weren't being fully achieved, and areas where actions were actually planned. The slightly odd thing is that student support wasn't seen as problematic, and yet institutions were actually planning a lot of actions for that. And I guess you could interpret that to say that institutions knew that there was a job to be done, but they understood what they needed to do in order to meet it. So there were certainly lots of actions planned, but it wasn't really seen as a big problem. They had provision that knew that they could improve it. So this is the top level of analysis. Here's a more detailed one, which is looking at the individual benchmarks. You won't be able to read these, but I will pick out one or two of them. So possibly the largest one in detail would be this issue of staff workload management. So this comes out very strongly across institutions. The development of academic communities is another one that features very highly. There's a different aspect of it which appears down here in student support. So this is something about social media. So that's another aspect of really a similar thing, development of academic communities. And the other one that's large is development of an e-learning strategy. So those are the three large ones there. Worth picking out a couple of the low ones. So in the area of student support generally, there are 5 benchmarks in here, but only one of them is being picked up at all. The others are zeros attached to it. So generally student support not seeing as being problematic. In terms of course delivery, there's one here which is also a zero, which is about reliability and security. And generally, the more technical things are not being picked out particularly high in there. So these were things that were seen as problematic or not so problematic. I'm going to move forward to the detail of actions that people have picked up. And again, it's similar with some differences. So workload management was high as problematic on in the self-assessment in terms of benchmarks that weren't being fully achieved. And thus again, there are some actions planned with that one. E-learning strategy was also high, actions planned to deal with benchmarks that are not fully achieved. This one is a little bit different. So this is to do with interactivity of course design, which wasn't showing up as particularly highly problematic, but yet institutions are planning lots of actions. And again, I think my interpretation would be that this is an area which people recognise as where they can take action, and so they're planning action. So they already have reasonable practice, but know that they could improve it. So lots of actions, even though it wasn't particularly rated as being a problem. And again, we have a similar thing down here generally in student support, where although many of those areas weren't rated as problematic, institutions are still planning lots of activity because they understand what they can do to improve things further.
We can think about the poll number 2 results,
yes.
which I've noted down. So the thing that came out most highly from your voting was actually the e-learning strategy, which was about 40% actually.
That's that one up there.
So that's consistent with both the roadmap findings here and also the need for improvement ones, the ones from the self-assessments. And then the next 2 that I noted were to do with staff. So staff workload, which you can see in blue there, was important by your judgment, and equally encouraging educational innovation was important, which is another one.
Is this one for staff support, and it kind of appears in the strategy up here as well, so it kind of appears in 2 places. But that's the staff related one there.
So there is some consistency between your own judgments here. I know it was just a rough and ready poll, and our findings from looking at the whole series of excellence reviews over these 10 years.
I'll just pick out use of OER, which is another one that was a 0 in terms of benchmark, whether things were achieved or not achieved on the previous slide, and is also low here in terms of actions. And I think people also didn't pick that one out in our little poll at the beginning. So OER doesn't really figure very strongly, which is perhaps a bit surprising.
Maybe that people are not very advanced in that area, so they don't really know what they should be doing, or don't have the confidence yet to put it into place, because it's quite a big thing to take on, I guess.
Shall I move on?
Yep. Okay, so just to summarise those main issues that came through, workload management, this is staff workload, not student workload, was quite a big one, and I think probably none of us working on the ground would be that surprised about that. But it does need to be taken seriously, because often one of the arguments that people put in place or have done historically for doing things through e-learning is that it can save costs, save time, but it seems pretty clear that it's not currently saving time, and it may be adding to workload for staff, so that needs to be managed quite carefully. Quite often people are expected to do e-learning in addition to their face-to-face teaching, which is not a very helpful way of doing things. The second one, which we've spoken about quite a lot here, is this whole issue of strategy, how you integrate a strategy for e-learning into the normal institutional education strategy. And then academic communities. So I think universities have taken quite serious steps in this area, but it tends to be small pockets. So some people have been trying out all sorts of things, other people less confident, or trying things out and identifying problems of various kinds which can arise. So that's identified as an issue that needs to be addressed. Particularly, should we or should we not be using all the public social media tools that are now available, And I've been looking at that for a number of years now, and things have not moved on particularly quickly, I think. And then John pointed out this issue of interactivity and what people are thinking about that, whether they're already thinking that they're doing quite a bit in that area, but need to do more. I think we would all agree that the more interactivity there is, the better and the more interesting it is for students, and the various kinds of e-learning tools that can help with that. And then we come down to these non-issues as we've labelled them. So we've discussed already student support as possibly not problematic, but people are trying to improve it nevertheless, which sounds good. And then a real non-issue is the technology, basically. And this aligns with my own experience from attending some of the E-xcellence reviews, that the support for the virtual learning environment and all the hardware and software that's necessary seems to be very good indeed. Which I've always found quite surprising and pleasing. So that seems to be not something that people should be particularly worried about. Okay, so moving through now. The local seminar, which is a label that we use for the event where the discussion takes place with the people at the university which is being assessed, and between the assessors from EADU who go to visit or who do it online sometimes nowadays. And this is the feedback that we've had from participants going back to one of the excellence projects, which was called Excellence Next. So people do find the framework, those 6 areas, quite helpful as a way of structuring their thinking and their discussions about this area, and they think it covers everything that's needed. They find it particularly useful to do this as a team, and this is what we definitely advise. So people from a range of different departments. So you've got some technical people from those who look after the VLE and the infrastructure. Definitely need people from senior management so that this whole issue of strategy can be discussed and the approach that the university is taking to e-learning. People have found that it's useful to get an external perspective, so that's from the assessors who go to visit, share their own experiences and throw some ideas in and discuss the ideas that the people at the university have themselves. So new ideas can emerge from that dialogue. And then clearly it's a point where reflection can happen, which in the day-to-day bustle of doing education and doing e-learning, you don't get that many opportunities to discuss with other people and to think about what's going well, what's not going so well, and what kind of things you might do in the future that might be different. And then finally to have some kind of analysis of that in people's minds through the discussion that's happening, and use that analysis to make some decisions for the future. These, again, some examples of feedback from the people who took part in some of the excellence reviews. This is from a project which was called Sequent, which is subsequent to the Excellence Next project. So again, it's the same kind of thing. It's the opportunity to discuss and think about what they're doing, how they might improve in the future, and to make some plans. And the excellence framework just provides a good structure for that. So you can see a few of the comments here from different people who were participating at the universities. And again, this is also from the Sequent project. So asking people whether they thought using the excellence method had any impact in their organisations, in their universities. And again, we can see that the opportunity to review and discuss has had value for them. But it reads quite provisional, some of this. So nobody's saying, yes, we've done things completely differently this year from last year, but they are saying it's given them an opportunity to have a think about it properly and to discuss it and to do some planning. Okay, and then we look at what QA agencies can do. Throughout the history of the excellence projects, we've been trying hard to involve the QA agencies in the different countries in the excellence process and in getting them to think about how e-learning can be assessed and should be assessed. This has been a struggle, hasn't it, John? It's been quite hard, I think. So we've visited a few QA bodies while we've been doing the excellence reviews, and they're interested, but they don't really say that much. But I think that's beginning to change, judging by that ENQA report. John's going to talk you through something a bit later, which is really, really, I think, very encouraging at the moment. So there's different things here that QA bodies could do from the point of view of the participants in the sequent excellence visits. And it'll be interesting to see how many different things the QA people really, really take on board as the world changes and as e-learning becomes more prevalent. Over to John now to take you through some interesting developments that are quite recent.
Well, just trying to situate E-xcellence into a sort of wider context, and wanted to direct you to this particular study that colleagues Eber, Keith, Brown, Anthony did, which took an overview of quality models, across the world to see what was available and so on. So it's worth having a look at. Just a couple of reflections that came out of that, which I've captured there, which is that these norm-based approaches that have been used possibly in the past are problematic because they tend to go obsolete. And so a focus on enhancement is probably the better way to go. Staff development is an issue that we've talked about several times. Is also seen as a challenge in many of those frameworks that have been looked at. And that the focus should be on principles and the importance of flexibility in quality model. And the lesson that was coming out quite strongly in that study was, again, this move towards a blend. Systems are converging, so the face-to-face sector should really learn from the distance education sector. So that's one sort of larger view of what's going on. I just wanted to pick out something that George talked about only yesterday, which was an activity that took place last October, which was joint between EAGTU and ENQA, looking at QA in blended and online education. And George reported on that quite fully yesterday in a webinar. But these are some of the things I've just picked out, which are the major challenges. And I think they do reflect largely the things that we've just been talking about in that little review of reviews, with some slight differences. So, for example, innovation comes up very strongly. And actually, there isn't, well, there are some benchmarks in E-xcellence that pick this up. There are different aspects of innovation, so particularly funding and so on, which are not captured directly by our benchmark. But again, staff development comes out quite strongly here. The issue of workload, generally the issue of student support, as I was saying, we have that strange thing that comes out that it's not really seen as problematic by institutions, but they are doing a lot of work in that area. And so clearly seems to be work to be done still. Pedagogical models and design for blended courses, I think, is certainly at the forefront of a lot of people's minds at the moment. Also ensure quality by focusing attention on that. I think that's all I want to mention there, except to refer back to the previous webinar. And similarly, Esther Huertas gave a webinar also yesterday, which summarized a recent publication from ENQA, which is a supplement to the European Standards and Guidelines, which looked at particular considerations for QA of e-learning. So the ESG is a sort of umbrella that would apply to all HE in Europe. And so this talks about the particular aspects where the mode of delivery includes e-learning. And she picked out some areas there where the working group felt there needed to be some additional indicators and so on, and they are the ones which are in bold, which are policy for QA, approval of the program, student-centered learning, teaching assessment, student admission, progression, recognition, certification, teaching staff, learning resources, and student support. The others were not so problematic. I think, again, this kind of echoes the message that we've had in our talk so far again. And if you look at the detailed indicators, which I won't do, but they are in Esther's talk, I think you will see echoes of the sort of thing that we picked up in this presentation. Just at the top level, you can see how E-xcellence maps against the ESG. So on the right-hand side, I've put the 6 large areas of E-xcellence, and you can see that they map quite closely to some of the 10 standards that ESG covers. So I think you can see how many of these systems actually do tie up quite nicely together, and they are different aspects of a rather similar approach that seems to be evolving to quality assurance.
It is worth looking at that report, I think, and it does seem to include quite a lot of the same kind of thinking that is in the excellence framework. So that's very nice to see. I think that's showing some impact and some influence now, which is great.
So I think we're really at an end of what we want to present. To say thank you very much for your attention. I've got George's email in there rather than Karen's.
That's okay.
I forgot to add Karen's to that.
John can forward me anything that you email to him.
Say thank you very much. If we want a sort of more structured discussion at the end, I will leave the last slide, which has some particular questions you might like to think about. So I'm going to move on to the final slide.
There is a little question in the chat there.
So somebody asking, curious to know if we have E-xcellence reviews repeated by the same institute after implementation of their roadmap. The answer to that is yes, we do have several where the institution has gone back and repeated it to regain the label after 3 or 5 years. There aren't sufficient that we could analyse in a statistical way, partly because not all of the reviews, we haven't really got the evidence from some of the reviews. For some reason, we've got missing things and so on. So the number that we have available isn't as large as we would like. So we're not able to do any sort of statistical analysis of that. But generally, I think people put into their roadmaps, maybe I shouldn't really say this, but they put into the roadmaps things that they're quite confident that they'll be able to deliver over the next period. So when you look at what people have put in their roadmaps and then look back, generally they've certainly ticked those boxes. They will have done those things, and probably they will have done a lot of other things that were in the backs of their minds, but they weren't willing to commit to in a formal document. So I think people are a little bit conservative over what they put in their roadmaps, and they only put in things that they're quite confident they can deliver. So actually, when you look back, you find that they will have done lots of other interesting things as well.
And Darko asks whether our analysis is in a paper. It is. It's in a paper which was presented at the EADTU conference last year. So that should be easy to find online in the proceedings.
There's also a short write-up of it in the EADTU Empower Envisaging report that was published in January. So I'm sure Lizzie or George might be able to put up a link for that. Is the roadmap a recommended number of years or up to institution? I'm saying 3 to 5 years is the timescale of the roadmap. I can't quite remember what's written in the documentation, but it's that sort of time period. Again, I think in practice, it struck me when I was looking at them that people were putting in things that they expected to do in the next year, actually. So they weren't putting in things that were long periods. They were quite focused on what they were expecting to do.
And we have, to what extent is the excellence label suitable for private distance education providers? I think it would be fine, absolutely suitable.
Yes, I think in terms of the content, I think it would be suitable and appropriate. I think in terms of formal label, there is an issue because they need to be, it's intended for members of the ADTU. So again, I think George would need to negotiate what happens if a private institution wants to obtain the label.
Okay. Looks like that's covered the questions in the chat.
I don't know if anyone does have any reflections on whether they think that these challenges might vary according to context, so different universities or different countries, or whether things are going to look very different in the future. Thank you. I think that's Lizzie putting up a link for the envisaging report. For the recording, I guess that's not going to be visible, but I'm sure you can find it with a Google search. The title is The Envisaging Report for Empowering Universities, 2nd edition, 2018. It's on the Empower website, empower.eadt.edu.
Okay, thanks, John and Karen. Thanks for the reflection of the first 10 years of E-xcellence, which we have worked very hard on developing the instrument, keeping the instrument up to date from the experiences of the reviews. So we have not only John and Karen and the review team, we have a number of experts all over Europe that are very familiar or contributors to the E-xcellence instrument and that are doing reviews at a distance or on site. Are there any other questions from Angeles?
Angeles has just put in a reflection which says, thank you, Karen and John. I think student support is relevant to other areas, as supporting our students is our final objective. I'm quite sure that students would find out much more areas in which support needs to be improved. And I think that's absolutely right, isn't it? It's a good reflection.
These discussion topics, which we put up, it probably isn't time to go into these in depth, but when we were doing the research work, we did think about whether it would be possible to analyse it further along the lines of different kinds of universities. So is a complete distance education provider different from a more blended learning context? And are there differences in different countries? Because clearly the environment in different countries is quite different. The funding way is different and all kinds of other things, the culture obviously. And then finally, what will be the challenges over the next 5 years? Well, we've covered that a little bit from the polls at the beginning, what you thought the current challenges are. It'd be interesting to think whether that might change in the future. And in this area, there's the Horizon reports, which come out annually, don't they? Which are trying to identify areas of e-learning, online learning, and technologies that might be influential in the future. So those are quite interesting to look at, to see if they raise any new challenges or if they open up any new opportunities which might happen.
Ones as well.
And we have our own, which are similar, the pedagogical innovation, I think they're called, reports. So these kind of things are quite interesting. You don't always agree with what's in there, but they're interesting to read. Thank you to everyone for coming along and listening and interacting via the polls. That was good fun at the beginning.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And do get in touch if there's anything else you want to follow up with us. We'd be very happy to be in touch.
Thank you very much, John. Karen, I'm just going to put the link to the manual of the E-xcellence here in the chat as well, so people can have a look at the third edition of E-xcellence. And if people are interested to in a review at a distance or on site by E-xcellence and by one of the reviewers, which may be John or Karen, you are most welcome to send an email to EDT offices. Thanks again, and I hope to see you soon. And we will see each other in Aarhus at the ED2 conference from the 10th till the 12th of October. Thanks. Bye bye.
Okay.
Bye.